Cornflakes were created to stop masturbation, and that's not even the weirdest part of human history. For 99% of human history, touching yourself wasn't a sin. In fact, in ancient Egypt, it was the literal act that created the universe. According to the most comprehensive sexual behavior study ever conducted in the United States, 92% of men and 62% of women report having done it at least once. So how did something so ancient, common, and sacred turn into a bizarre medical panic that invented your breakfast cereal? The truth involves primate biology, who did it in the middle of a crowded marketplace on purpose, and a very confused Swiss doctor, 2-century medical panic invented. Let's start at the very beginning, because this habit is tens of millions of years older than humanity itself. In June 2023, a team of researchers led by Dr. Matilda Brindle at UCL Anthropology published the largest dataset of primate masturbation ever assembled, drawing on nearly 400 sources, including 246 published academic papers and 150 first-hand accounts from primatologists and zookeepers. Their goal was to answer a question that had puzzled evolutionary biologists for decades. From a pure survival standpoint, masturbation shouldn't exist. It costs time and energy, and by definition, it doesn't lead to reproduction. So why does it show up so consistently in both males and females across almost the entire primate order, in the wild and in captivity? The team's findings, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, pointed to two competing explanations, and the evidence supported both. The first is called the post-copulatory selection hypothesis. In species where males mate rarely and briefly, masturbating before sex can increase arousal and help them ejaculate faster once the opportunity actually arrives, which matters enormously if you're a lower-ranking male at constant risk of being interrupted mid-copulation by a more dominant rival. The second is the pathogen avoidance hypothesis. Ejaculation flushes the urethra, and the data showed that male masturbation frequency co-evolved directly with higher rates of sexually transmitted infection risk across the primate family tree. In other words, it may function as a built-in cleaning mechanism. And this wasn't a recent adaptation. Brindle's team concluded that masturbation was almost certainly present in the last common ancestor of all monkeys and apes, humans included, which pushes its origin back tens of millions of years. It gets stranger the further out you go. Marine iguanas, a completely different branch of the animal kingdom entirely, have their own version. Smaller males, who get physically shoved away from females by larger dominant males the moment mating starts, masturbate in advance and store the ejaculate in a small pouch at the tip of the penis. Then, the next time an opportunity opens up, even for just a few seconds, they're ready immediately. It's not an accident, and it's not dysfunction. It's a strategy that evolution kept around because it worked. So by the time actual Homo sapiens shows up roughly 300,000 years ago, this isn't a new behavior we invented. It's something we inherited, fully formed, from tens of millions of years of primate evolution before us. Which raises the real question this video is actually about. Not why does this behavior exist? Biology already answered that. The real mystery is what humans decided to think about it once we became the one species capable of having an opinion. And the very first recorded opinion we have wasn't shame. It was reverence. Around 2400 to 2300 BCE, in the pyramid of King Unas near Saqqara, Egyptian priests carved a series of religious texts into the pyramid's interior walls, known today as the Pyramid Texts, among the oldest religious writings in the world. Central to these texts is the Heliopolitan creation myth, one of ancient Egypt's foundational stories about how existence itself began. Before anything existed, the story goes, there was only none, an infinite, dark, formless ocean. From within that nothingness, a god named Atum created himself and rose up onto a small mound of solid earth, the very first land to ever exist. And then, alone in the universe with nothing and no one else around him, Atum masturbated. From that single act, his own bodily fluid became the first two other beings in existence: Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Every subsequent god in Egyptian mythology, every element of the world the Egyptians understood, traces its lineage back through that first act. Some versions of the text describe Atum spitting instead, but masturbation is the dominant and earliest account, and the language used in the pyramid texts is direct about it. This wasn't an embarrassing footnote the priests tried to soften or explain away. It was carved permanently into the eternal resting place of a king, meant to be read and understood for the rest of time. In Heliopolitan theology, the entire universe, the sky, the air, the moisture, humanity itself, exists because a solitary god pleasured himself in the dark. There was no taboo attached to it whatsoever. It was creation itself. Now travel forward almost 2,000 years into a completely different civilization with a completely different relationship to modesty, and you'll find something even stranger. Not sacred. Deliberately, defiantly public. Around 340 BCE in Athens, a philosopher named Diogenes of Sinope, founder of the school of thought known as Cynicism, walked into the middle of the crowded agora, the city's busiest public marketplace, lifted his robes, and masturbated in front of everyone. This is recorded by the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, as one of several deliberately shocking public acts Diogenes performed, alongside eating in public and urinating on people who insulted him. When onlookers confronted him, Diogenes reportedly said something to the effect that he wished hunger could be satisfied, as easily by simply rubbing an empty stomach. This wasn't random exhibitionism. Diogenes built his entire philosophy around exposing the arbitrary line society draws between what's shameful and what isn't. His argument, roughly, went like this. If eating in public is completely unremarkable, why is another basic bodily need treated as unspeakable? He wasn't trying to normalize public masturbation as a general practice. He was using it as a piece of philosophical theater, forcing the people of Athens to confront the fact that their disgust wasn't rooted in logic, it was rooted purely in convention. And it worked well enough that the story survived for over 2,000 years specifically because it was so shocking. So here's where we are so far. In one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, the act was sacred enough to describe the creation of the universe itself. In classical Greece, one of history's most famous philosophers used it as a public argument against arbitrary shame. Neither treated it as a hidden, private failure. So when exactly did that change? The honest answer is startlingly recent and startlingly traceable to one specific pamphlet. In 1712, an anonymous, unlicensed pamphlet began circulating through the roughly 2,000 coffee houses of London. Its full title was Onania, or the heinous sin of self-pollution and all its frightful consequences, in both sexes considered. Published anonymously by a private press, it claimed masturbation caused a horrifying list of ailments in both men and women, ranging from headaches and rheumatism to gonorrhea, infertility, and eventually a slow, agonizing death. There was no actual medical evidence behind any of it. It was, by most modern historical accounts, essentially an early piece of viral fear-based marketing, since the pamphlet conveniently also sold a cure alongside its warnings. It might have faded into obscurity as just another sensationalist tract, except that in 1760 a genuinely respected and prominent Swiss physician named Samuel Auguste Tissot published a far more serious and scientific-sounding treatise called L'Onanie, expanding these claims with the full authority of formal medicine behind them. Tissot's central argument rested on the old humoral theory of the body, the belief that health depended on a careful balance of internal fluids. He claimed semen was, in his words, an essential oil, so concentrated and vital that losing just 1 ounce of it was equivalent to losing 40 ounces of blood. Masturbation, in his framework, was the single most damaging way a person could deplete this vital fluid, since he believed it traveled from the brain, down the spinal column, and out of the body, taking a portion of a person's mental and physical strength along with it every single time. Tissot's treatise wasn't dismissed as quackery, it was treated as legitimate science, cited approvingly by figures as prominent as Voltaire and Immanuel Kant, and it effectively launched a full-blown medical panic that lasted close to 200 years. Physicians throughout the 18th and 19th centuries built entire careers treating what they now sincerely believed was a genuine, life-threatening disease. By the late 1800s, this fear had escalated into outright industry. One of the most prominent anti-masturbation campaigners of the era was an American physician named John Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg believed diet directly influenced sexual urges, and specifically that a bland, unstimulating diet could suppress the desire to masturbate in young people. In 1894, he developed a very specific plain, dry breakfast cereal for exactly this purpose. That cereal was cornflakes. The graham cracker, invented a few decades earlier by a minister named Sylvester Graham for closely related reasons, exists for essentially the same purpose. Two foods that are still sitting in kitchens all over the world right now were invented, at least in part, as anti-masturbation devices, and it went considerably further than food. Medical suppliers throughout the 19th century manufactured and sold actual physical restraint devices, spiked rings and cages designed to be worn to make masturbation physically painful or impossible. And some physicians, including Kellogg himself, recommended circumcision on young boys specifically as a deterrent, believing reduced sensitivity would suppress the urge entirely. What had once been a foundational creation myth carved into the tomb of a king was now, in the space of about a century, being treated as a disease requiring surgical prevention. Here's a detail that trips almost everyone up, and it's worth clearing up directly, because it explains where the entire word onanism came from in the first place. The term is a direct reference to a story in the book of Genesis, chapter 38, about a man named Onan. In the biblical account, Onan is obligated under the custom of levirate marriage to father a child with his deceased brother's widow. Instead, he withdraws before completion, spilling his seed on the ground rather than complete the act, and is struck down for it. For centuries, this story has been popularly reinterpreted as a condemnation of masturbation specifically. It isn't. Most biblical scholars agree the passage is actually about Onan's refusal to fulfill a specific family and inheritance obligation through withdrawal, not about masturbation at all. But by the time Tissot and the authors of Onania were writing, the word had already been permanently and inaccurately attached to an entirely different act. The mislabeling stuck so completely that it's still the term used today. This medicalized fear didn't fully lift until the mid-20th century, and when it finally did, it happened almost overnight, thanks largely to one deeply controversial biologist. In 1948, an Indiana University zoologist named Alfred Kinsey, who had spent the earlier part of his career studying gall wasps before being asked to teach a course on marriage and sexuality, published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, based on more than 12,000 personal interviews collected over roughly a decade. Kinsey followed it in 1953 with Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. Together, these two studies became known simply as the Kinsey Reports, and they are still considered the largest and most detailed surveys of human sexual behavior ever conducted. Kinsey's data found that 92% of men and 62% of women reported having masturbated at some point in their lives, numbers that directly contradicted nearly 2 centuries of medical literature insisting the practice was rare, shameful, and pathological. The male report caused controversy but ultimately became a bestseller. The female report, published 5 years later, caused something closer to a genuine cultural crisis. There were public book burnings. Newspapers accused Kinsey of exaggerating and of interviewing an unrepresentative sample of women willing to discuss such things. Politicians and religious leaders condemned the findings as a threat to the moral fabric of the country. But the data held up, and it fundamentally, permanently changed the scientific conversation. For the first time in nearly 200 years, there was hard statistical evidence that what Tissot had called a rare and catastrophic disease was, in reality, something close to a biological universal. So here's the full arc. A behavior present in the shared ancestor of every monkey and ape on the planet, tens of millions of years before a single human being existed. A behavior so sacred in one of history's oldest civilizations that it was carved into a king's tomb as the literal origin of the universe. A behavior used deliberately, publicly, and philosophically by one of ancient Greece's most famous minds to challenge arbitrary social shame. And then, for a genuinely small slice of that entire timeline, roughly 200 years out of hundreds of thousands, an accidental pamphlet and one very persuasive but very wrong Swiss doctor convinced an enormous portion of the Western world that this same ancient, biologically universal behavior was a disease requiring cornflakes, spiked rings, and surgery to prevent. We didn't discover something new about masturbation in the 20th century. We simply, slowly, found our way back to roughly where Atum's priests and Diogenes' Athens already were, thousands of years earlier. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about the strange, uncomfortable, and often surprisingly ancient gap between what we assume about being human and what the actual historical and scientific record shows. If that's something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive.